Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name's Brian if you're new around here, but if you're a returning subscriber, welcome back, you beautiful legend. That's what you get for subscribing, by the way. Free compliments at the start of these videos. Now, I've seen some discussion going off in the comments on Discord, and I thought I'd spend some time today to really talk about what a player-driven economy is and what it's not. And I see a lot of people making the assumption that just player trade equals a player-driven economy, and I want to put out the definition, really get into the detail. What are the downsides? What are the upsides? What does it offer to the players and to the culture? And explore that for you guys in this video so that hopefully we have a better understanding of how we view the MMO, how we view the genre itself, and hopefully to build a better, I guess, more discussion-oriented future for these kind of games. Now, I say the downsides, I say the upsides. There is no perfect system out there. You're never going to find the perfect utopian MMORPG, but we can always learn and iterate from these different systems to try and find hopefully a better solution that devs can draw inspiration from. And that's the hope of these series, and that's the hope of these kind of discussions. Now, for me, a player-driven economy is absolutely vital for an MMORPG, but I say vital and not required, because you do not need a player-driven economy to have an MMORPG, but I think it's a system that has long been forgotten, and that's why I'm actually really excited for the next round of MMOs that are bringing it back, and I'm really hopeful for the future, and especially to see what changes and what value that could bring to the player. But this video, I want to structure it a couple different ways. I'm going to start with the downsides. I'm going to talk about the struggles and reasons why we don't actually see many player-driven economies, or at least haven't seen them over the span of the popular MMOs for the last decade or so. Then I want to talk to you about the value that it actually gives you, the player. What are some of the upsides to a player-driven economy? And then I want to talk about what impacts this has on kind of the culture of the MMORPG. There's what I talk about a lot is kind of the hidden costs of these systems. We talk about matchmaking. Matchmaking has a value to the player, but there's actually a hidden cost. And sometimes that cost is great. And you might not never think about it. You might not see it for a while, but over the course of time, you end up starting to see kind of the cracks and some of the weaknesses in some of these convenience-based systems. And that's what this is going to focus in on today, but this is focusing in on the player-driven economy aspect. So hopefully you guys enjoy today's video. It often occurs to me that as I speak about MMOs, a lot of people tend to think that I speak about them in this bubbly, utopian-based way. Like, oh, Brian clearly thinks that this is the perfect model for the MMO. No, that's when I always advocate for more player-driven choice and also options within the genre landscape itself. More MMOs, not less, more player choice to go and find systems and reward people taking risks and experimenting rather than, really kind of leaning into your comfort zone. But that's where I think this video is important to open up with the downsides of a player-driven economy. First and off the bat, you'll see this, and we'll talk about RMT and botting, real money trade, players who are spending their real money to get in-game currency, and botting, players who are using bots to try and farm up resources and materials so that they can have a competitive advantage in the economy. Now, to start with this, it's also important to note that games that don't have player-driven economies also have these same problems, but they're not as severe. The risk to the player base overall isn't as severe as it would be in a player-driven economy. Thus, the downside about a PDE literally comes into that the devs, the service-based operational team, has to do a better job at culling that, at maintaining that, at monitoring that, at putting in various different restrictions and things on top of the economy to make sure that you don't have people who are going to cheat and ultimately gain power. Because in a player-driven economy, gold, gil, whatever your in-game currency is a form of power, and that gives you buying power, selling power. It gives you the ability to manipulate the market to varying degrees, much like a real world economy. So there is a greater damage that a RMT and a bot can do in a player-driven economy over any other game, but they do have those same problems persisting between both. So I'm personally not too worried about the RMT and the botting, so to say. I think that comes into how do you execute your plan in policing the economy. First and foremost, do you release kind of a report showing here's the bans, because that's essentially what I think players need. In fact, speaking on New World, I think that's what they need to do when you compare it to something like Final Fantasy XIV, who releases kind of a monthly report on accounts that have been banned for selling gold and for botting. I still think that you'll find, and I don't understand somebody buying gold in a game like Final Fantasy XIV, but that's because we'll get more into our definition of what a player-driven economy is here as we go through this video itself. But I can understand it, especially like in a game like Final Fantasy XI, or even in New World to varying degrees. All right, so perhaps the best counter argument to a player-driven economy that I see is that players don't want a second job or to treat this MMO like a job, feeling like you're constantly falling behind because there are players who can play longer than you, who thus are making more money than you, who have more, therefore, power than you in any kind of in-game economy. We're seeing this actually in its a part with New World, where players are waiting for the fresh start server so they don't automatically feel like they're behind. They're not necessarily even talking about their level or gear score, but gold, gil, represents a form of power in a player-driven economy, and thus that could feel like you're automatically at a disadvantage. And that's why when it comes to a PDE, you got to have some forms of regulations and various different things in place. A lot more effort goes into it, but I think the benefits far outweigh the disadvantages personally. Now we'll talk more about that, but specifically to this counter argument, I think this also then falls into the view of what is an MMO. And this perhaps next thing that I'm about to say could be its own video, because there's going to be a buzzword I'm going to use, but please just pause for a second and let what I'm about to say sink in, and kind of pause before we react to this, the buzzword, because it is a buzzword, but anyway, we'll just jump into it because I'm already dreading these comments. First and foremost, if you look at what the first and the early MMOs were, in a way, they were their own metaverses. And regardless of what we're thinking with the buzzword with metaverses, it's this place that you existed outside of the reality, like it was an online space. Now we've seen the latest in the evolution of the MMO really being a multiplayer online game. It just might be set in a bigger landscape. So we've seen a lot of these systems kind of changing and becoming more convenience focused and less focused in on what maybe the metaverses that are now trying to be created are trying to capture, this second place that you can go and live. And in a way, the metaverses is an evolution of what the early MMOs were establishing themselves as, and what the new ones are trying to then incorporate. So it's going to be interesting to see how these different labels and terms ultimately shake out over the next 10 years. But that's essentially kind of where you go with it. Like if you're looking for a place that is this other world that you exist in, that is what some people are seeking. Not everybody is seeking that. And I think essentially you kind of have, it could be a generational thing. It could be just an expectations thing. It could be what was your first experience with an MMO that ends up kind of defining how you look at the genre itself. It's one of the things we've been exploring on the podcast with various different content creators. So if you guys are interested, check out Epic Loot Radio. Links are on the description. We film it live here on Wednesdays, typically, where we just talk about like what these systems are, what these impacts are. So I hope you guys have been enjoying that. Anyway, but that's where I think there's a friction and there's a frustration, and it could be a generational friction or frustration, but I think it's also in terms of like what you're looking for in a game. And I think that there are some value in convenience features, right? And that's why I said this is a bigger topic for another video. But I think that when we look at it, it's you have to balance. You have to look at what you want to do, what you want to accomplish. And I think in the game design, I do think that there is a way to have kind of the best of both worlds, but we're still seeing that friction kind of play out in real time. And I'm excited to see that more and more games are going to be attempting these systems in the future to get more data to see and kind of work out like what is the best balance, so that players who don't have a lot of playtime aren't left behind in a player-driven economy, and players that have a lot more playtime are rewarded for that. And maybe again, bigger topic for another day. All right, so we've talked about the downsides and like the MMO definition and that whole metaverse-esque ball of chaos. But what is a player-driven economy, and what are its upsides? What are its values that it brings to the culture and to the player? First and foremost, in my definition, the player-driven economy is that if you run content, you're not going to get immediately rewarded with a piece of gear. You might be, that is an option. You don't have to like completely cut out all gear, but chances are the greatest opportunity that you get is materials. The reason you end up getting materials for running the raid or killing the boss is those materials then get put into the economy. The economy then turns that into various different products that you yourself can benefit from. It's less instant gratification and less dopamine per the content, but it has I guess a deeper, wider, slower type of kind of burn and investment. It also helps add value to the content itself, where if gold is power and you can go clear a hard boss or a hard raid, you're going to be the supplier for the materials that are in demand by a lot of players. And so there is this asynchronous socialization that is happening in the content itself. But what's also happening here is you end up seeing more players actually needing other players in the game. And so a player-driven economy does require an active and populous player base, because you end up spreading out the demand and the need. And so you end up like bringing up casuals in terms of the content that they might specifically be looking for. And it ends up also challenging them to maybe step into the content that you might be skilled at. So raiders need casuals, casuals need raiders way more than ever before. Right now, in a non-player driven economy, to use Final Fantasy XIV as a good example, is that need comes in the form of that there's more casuals funding the game so that the raiders can get more of the hardcore content that they desire to be played. But the question that I would have for you is, in terms of this, is that what is difficult content? Like, think about that for a second. What is difficult content? Economics in a player-driven economy actually balance the scales. So think about it for you. What might be difficult for you might not be difficult for me, and vice versa. And to kind of put this into scale, and some of the comments that I've seen and kind of replied to is that, imagine for a second, somebody, it was Darkside Royalty. I love their content. They covered Destiny, had him on the podcast, great guy. But he said, like, I don't want the equivalent of beating a boss as the same as picking 1,000 flowers, for example. And I thought that was an interesting analogy. And then I go, well, what about 1 billion flowers or 100 trillion flowers? Now, you might be thinking, well, clearly beating the boss is that kind of pinnacle content, but that might be what is pinnacle for you and not for me. Or might be me beating the boss might be what's pinnacle for me, but not for you. But economics really kind of leverage the scales in that degree and define what essentially is difficult content by putting value and player demand on that content itself. So if you can beat the boss and supply needed materials for the server, you'll get rich and wealthy, and it will make it very easy for you to acquire your own goals, so to speak, and vice versa. Maybe you don't have a lot of time, or maybe you're not interested in doing that challenge, but you like to craft those weapons for the players and feel like you're adding value to their success. And so it's that asynchronous, socialization, and in a way, asynchronous multiplayer that happens. And I think it's a beautiful thing. I think economics in that regards help balance the scales, because the players in a way have more choice and more freedom, because they are ultimately the ones deciding what is valuable and what is the server value overall. And I think we've lost that over the course of the last decade, at least in terms of the MMO, where we see everything kind of more isolated. You are the one-man god-slaying machine versus that you are just one person and you need other people to survive, much like we do in this real world. Somebody, I think, put out a video about how they tried to make a hamburger and they did it all from literal scratch. They had to grow the crops. They had to do all these things. They had to get, where they couldn't rely on anybody, and how expensive that was and how difficult that was. But in terms of that, spreading out that, we all achieve more when we're doing something like unattainable together, I guess many hands make light work would be a good way to summarize this section. And perhaps a final thought to kind of wrap up the what they offer the culture in general is, in a way, being that we need each other to achieve these bigger things, as opposed to being kind of these one, man god-killing machines. I think it helps foster a level of empathy for other players, as opposed to looking at another player, somebody who could be potentially slowing them down. That's what I see within the culture, and it does frustrate me, but there's also these are other systems that are connecting into a player-driven economy. This isn't the one pillar that really kind of makes or breaks the game, and maybe we'll explore that more as the series kind of evolves itself. But can you still, I want to kind of clarify a few things before we wrap up. Can you still have loot drops in a player-driven economy? And like I said, yes, loot drops are going to be rare, though. You can get a piece of gear that does drop, but it's not the norm. You're going to more likely farm up the materials, which puts the demand on the crafters, and then that essentially helps the kind of economy grow. Can you also have bind on equip and bind on pickup? My personal preference is I'm okay with bind on equip. I think that makes sense because that's always going to help continue to have a demand for gear, because once you buy a piece of gear and equip it, it's yours. It's not going back into the economy and deflating the value of gear and the demand for that. But bind on pickup, I think, should be a very, very rare case indeed, because bind on pickup maybe for a few or handful of things, but I see too much bind on pickup because then it essentially just kind of sits, it's yours, and then you end up either just breaking it down or just getting rid of it completely. And so my personal preference is really very soft-handedly bind on pickup. But bind on equip, I think, makes a sense, especially in a world of endless resources where the real world isn't. So that kind of helps simulate that a little bit. So Brian, is this just a boomer's point of view? And maybe perhaps, but I do feel like there are some systems that should be revisited in future iterations of the MMO. And actually what we're seeing many games kind of attempting right now with New World, Ashes of Creation. It's going to be interesting to see ultimately where Pantheon falls. I haven't really been following that development, but you guys can let me know. And then even Blue Protocol announced that they were going to have a player-driven economy, even though we haven't heard anything from that game in the last year. So at its core, I'm excited to see more of those systems being reintroduced to the player base. That will cause some friction because people aren't used to that mindset, and hopefully maybe I can help educate the positives of these systems being in place in the long run of it. And then finally, could Final Fantasy XIV still implement a player-driven economy? And Final Fantasy XIV actually had one in 1.0 all the way through 1.23, but based off the current development, I think it would take a massive amount of work to overhaul the economy of Final Fantasy XIV. The risk in my mind would be too great, both to the current player base and to just the systems overall. In the long run, I don't see that happening with 14. However, if Yoshi P gets to develop a brand new MMO like he says he wants to, I could see that happening at that time. I could see Final Fantasy, whatever comes next for Yoshi P, in terms of the MMO, actually having that, because that's actually from his own personal preference. That's something that he prefers. He enjoys that older style MMORPG as well, but the economics of these games don't necessarily make sense. But based off of what Square Enix recently just released talking about their own financials, I don't know if that's going to be a reality that we'll see at some point here in the near future. So we can only hope and speculate at this point. Now, all that being said, guys, thank you so much for your time. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I appreciate you for checking it out. I'm looking forward to reading your comments as always, but until next time, take care.